course, we start with remembering our dear friend Adam, who was such a big part and such a big loss to all of us. But we will study Torah and bring his neshama, his soul, joy and comfort, and to his family as well, who find comfort in the fact that we have dedicated this course to his memory. So I want to say about tonight's class that tonight's class could be helpful in two ways. It could be helpful for those who are still grieving, or anytime a person grieves, to be able to find a way to grieve and to find comfort and so on. And hopefully this is beneficial. The other angle is how we could help others who we know, friends, family, and so on, who are grieving, to allow them, to help them through the process of the mourning process and to be able to move forward and so on. So those are the two things that we want to try to accomplish tonight. But here's a little cute little video that I wanted to share to sort of contrast last week's class, or the last 2 weeks, with this week's class. So this week is lesson number 3, the morning after.
Jean-Francois Gravelet, better known as Blondin, was a famous tightrope walker and acrobat. He's perhaps best known for his many crossings of a tightrope, 1,100 feet in length, suspended 160 feet above Niagara Falls in the USA. His act would be watched by large crowds and begin with a relatively simple crossing using a balancing pole. Then he would throw away the pole and amaze the onlookers. On one occasion, he crossed the tightrope on stilts. On another occasion, blindfolded. Another time, he stopped halfway to cook and eat an omelette. In 1860, a royal party from England came to watch Blondin perform. After his normal spectacular crossings, he then wheeled a wheelbarrow from one side to the other as the crowd cheered. Next, he put a sack of potatoes into the wheelbarrow and wheeled that across. The crowd cheered louder. Then he approached the royal party and asked the Duke of Newcastle, "Do you believe that I could take a man across the tightrope in this wheelbarrow?" "Yes, I do," said the Duke. "Ah, hop in," replied Blondin. The crowd fell silent, but the Duke of Newcastle would not accept Blondin's challenge. "Is there anyone else here who believes I could do it?" asked Blondin. No one was willing to volunteer. Eventually, an old woman stepped out of the crowd and climbed into the wheelbarrow. Blondin wheeled her all the way across and all the way back. The old woman was Blondin's mother, the only person willing to put her life in his hands.
Okay, so there's also to tell a story of the rabbi who was always preaching the importance of patience, especially for children, and to deal with them with warmth and love and passion and compassion, So one day the rabbi walks out of his house. He sees a couple children playing in the newly laid concrete in his driveway. So he became very irritated and started to yell and scream at the kids, "Get out, what are you doing?" So there was someone on the side noticed, the rabbi is always preaching, compassion and warmth and love to the children, that he screams at them this way. So he approached the rabbi. He says, "I don't understand. How do you respond this way to the children?" He says, "I'll tell you like this. I love children. I love them in the abstract, not in the concrete." So we had a little story, a little video, and a little joke to begin the class. But the message of both is that there is a very big difference between theory and practice. And the last 2 weeks, we spoke a lot about the soul and the soul growing and the soul living on and so on. But the real question is, how do we bring these ideas into practice when it comes to something that creates so much emotion and sadness and pain, such as mourning, the loss of a loved one? So how do we cope? How do we cope? How do we deal with loss? What's the Jewish perspective? So we're going to begin tonight's lesson with two real life stories that sort of remind us of the different kinds of responses that people have when it comes to loss. So I'm going to ask, let's go to Julie. If you can unmute yourself, you should be able to. If you could read text number 1 on page 84, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. "Boys," she yelled, "what are you up to?" There was no answer. She found her two boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. "You jokers," she said with a smile. "What was that sound?" They shrugged. "Where is your father?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband, John, writhing on the floor. John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication, and it had seemed to be working, but suddenly he had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. Then she called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could have ever happened to her. Heather Lindquist had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married and purchased a small ranch-style home. They had children. They got a dog. The schools were good and the community was stable. Heather thought that the television was on more than it should be, but other than that, everything seemed to be in order. Then John died, and she had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times, but Heather found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. "I expected to collapse, I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do," Heather explained, "but I couldn't. Each day I got up and I did what I had to. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course, we all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I love those boys so much. John would have been very proud of them."
Thank you. So you know what, Julie? Why don't you just
I
continue?
relate to that, by the way. I felt a little emotion coming on.
I saw some. You know what? Then let's give Elaine, if you could try to put yourself.
Okay.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I'm gonna put Julie. Okay, go ahead. Read text number 2. We're on page 86.
Okay. In 2004, Stephanie Moldberg of Shore Hills, New Jersey, lost her son Eric to Ewing sarcoma, a bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Mrs. Moldberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. "I felt guilty all the time, guilty about living," she said. "I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess. And I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while they didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need to get your life back, they'd say. But how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I?
So there are many, many differences between these two stories, of course. And we have to understand, of course, that there are different circumstances. One of them we're talking about a husband, the other one is a child. One seems to have family, other children, and a spouse. The other one we don't know. But people also, even if the circumstances were the same, no one reacts the same way to the same circumstance, to the same tragedy. So people's reactions are very, very different. So again, here they might have been very different circumstances, but even if they were the same, it's very possible that they would have also reacted very differently. So, we can never compare people, and we can never judge people for how they deal with pain and loss and so on. Tonight, what we want to try to do is see what is the Torah's perspective to, again, as I mentioned in my introduction, to see how we could overcome our own pain and loss and grief, and number two, how does the Torah see our role in helping others, friends of ours, be able to get over, move forward from a loss and tragedy or whatever the situation was. So our focus again is on the bereaved survivors. How do they move forward? Okay, so we're going to cover three things in our lesson. Number one, we're going to discuss the Torah's view of mourning and grief. How should one act following a loss, which is the mourning period? How can one be comforted, and so on. In the second part of the lesson, we are going to discuss the Torah's principles for dealing with chronic grief, where a person is distressed and can't seem to move forward, and how to deal with that. And finally, in the end of the class, we are going to learn ways of visiting those who are grieving, which is the Shiva period, how to really make sure that the Shiva period is used to its fullest, we can take advantage of it because of its importance. It's a very, very important period, and if it's done right, it's helpful. And as we'll see, if it's not done right, leaves the person still grieving even after the Shiva, and doesn't allow the person to move forward. We'll move now to page 87. And I'm going to ask, let's see who could read the text. Eddie Canio, if you could take yourself off mute, and if you could read the text on page 87.
Socrates instructed, Cebes, please relate the following message to Evenus, and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me, by immediately leaving this world. If he be a wise man, and not tarry, and that today I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must. Simmias said, "What a message for such a man. Having been a frequent companion of his, I should say that, as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged." "Why," said Socrates, "is not Avenus a philosopher?" "I think that he is," said. "Then he, or any man who has the spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another. We are biblically
Okay,
commanded."
that's good. That's good, Eddie. Thank you. Okay, so Socrates basically sees the spirit as more important, and he sees death as illogical. And it sort of seems that, based on what we discussed the last couple of weeks, that the true life of a human being isn't a body. The true life is the soul. And the soul lived before it came into the body. The soul will continue to live after it came to the body. The body is just a shell. And so the question is, why in Judaism do we not, I should say, why in Judaism do we make a big deal out of mourning instead of sort of just dismissing it? If in Judaism we believe so much in the soul, and that the soul is the most important part of us, let's dismiss the body. And when the body finishes, okay, that's it. If we really believe that the soul lives on, what is the reason that the Torah would put an emphasis, not just allow, but an emphasis, a mourning, to the point that the Torah actually says it's a mitzvah? Maimonides, it's the Book of Laws of Mourning, in text number 4, page 88, he says, we are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. So again, if death isn't an end, why would we mourn or emphasize or create this and make this a mitzvah? In fact, we believe that this world is considered alma de shikra, which means a world of falsehood. What we see, what we experience in this world is truly false. It's not the true world, which is godliness, etc., which means, why are we focusing and creating a mitzvah of mourning the loss of the shell, of the container of the soul, which doesn't seem to be so significant? So we're going to see there are 3 reasons why the Torah encourages and creates a mitzvah out of mourning. So the first one we see in Nachmanides. So Nachmanides says, text number 5a, page 89, the Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death. Why? Because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they are alive. Which means here he doesn't really explain why it's a mitzvah. But he explains that first and foremost, Torah acknowledges the pain, the human pain, that it's natural to have pain, and the Torah acknowledges it and therefore allows mourning. But it doesn't explain why the Torah would make it a mitzvah. So we go into text 5b, and that is from Maimonides, and Maimonides gives us a reason for the mitzvah of mourning. Mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of lighthearted activities. So basically, there are psychological benefits to mourning, and therefore the Torah encourages the mourning period, and not only recognizes and acknowledges the reality of the emotions, but the Torah also encourages it because of the psychological benefits. But there's one more text, and that is text number 5c. One of this generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? And this is the Radvaz. This is the response of the Radvaz. He lived from 1479 to 1573. So he answered as follows. He said, such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers, who maintained that this world is without purpose. By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions that in this world that we merit to the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days of weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for restrictions on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts, etc. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise. So one of the things that we sort of focused on is on the reality of the soul, the reality of the spiritual worlds, and the fakeness, so to speak, of the world around us, which means our inability to recognize the true identity of what's around us. We tend to see falsehood. In this sense, the term fake news would be very appropriate. We look around us and what we see is not always the reality. And we know that in general, because in general, even again, I'm not talking about the news out there. I'm talking about our own perception. When we look around and we see things, there are many times when we see things and they're not the true reality. It's only later when someone makes us aware of something else that we say, oh, now I understand what was really going on. And there are a lot of times that like last week, right? We saw that video of the game. Was it basketball or whatever game it was? And there was an image walking, which we didn't really pay attention to. We couldn't see it because we were paying attention to one thing and we didn't see the something else that was going on. So the truth is that while we tend not to have a true appreciation of this world, and we recognize that the soul is of utmost importance, that doesn't take away from the fact that we actually do recognize the importance of this physical world. Again, what we were saying was that our perception of the physical world may not be correct. But it doesn't mean this physical world is not important. The soul is extremely important, even though we don't see it. The soul lived before and lived afterwards. At the same time, the soul's function and mission in this world is real, which means that the experience in this world is a real experience, and that this is part of what this is what God wanted. God created this world, put the soul here down into this world to be able to fulfill a mission. And so this world has purpose. And that is the reason, one of the reasons that causes us to be pained when someone passes away, because we recognize that a person is in this world with a mission, with purpose, and now that purpose and that mission has ended. And because we recognize this world and value this world, in other religions, many other religions, this world is just a step to get to the next world. For us, this world is not a step to get to the next world. This world is the true purpose. The soul's mission in this world is only a time, something that has its limits and time frame. Each soul comes in for a limited amount of time to accomplish something. But the world, this is the whole purpose. The whole purpose of all of the creations of souls and everything was to be able to come down and to impact this world, which is why when Mashiach comes, all the souls will finally come back into this world. So again, we recognize that souls are very important. And ultimately, the soul lived before and the soul lived afterwards. And the relationship, we can keep a relationship with our loved ones even after they pass away because the soul is real and the soul continues to live on. However, at the same time, we also recognize that their life in this world is important and relevant, not just because of our human emotions, but because the Torah recognizes and Judaism recognizes that there is purpose to being in this world. And that is a reason why the Torah not only recognizes, number two, encourages, but makes it into a mitzvah to mourn, because by mourning, when we mourn, we're recognizing that this person had a mission in this world and that there's value to this world. So the obligation, as we could see on page 92, the obligation to mourn is generally limited to the highest form of mourning is to parents, and that's because of kibbud avim, which is respect and honor that we are supposed to accord to our parents. And therefore, as we will see later in today's lesson, that the period of time to mourn for a parent is actually longer than for others. Then siblings and a spouse, and then, God forbid, we should never know, but of a son or a daughter, that is something that we also have to mourn for. So, as we explained, the Torah validates and commands us to mourn. When it comes to mourning, there are many different steps, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the steps of mourning, the different periods of mourning, but we're going to go through them. We're going to skip the Shiva, and we're going to come back to the Shiva at the end of tonight's class, but we're going to just go through the steps before Shiva, the 30 days, the 12 months, and the Yartzeit. So the first step is called Aninut. It's a period of time where a person is not able to process this. The person's not mourning yet. There's a numbness at this point, a disbelief. And this period of time is from the moment the person passes away until the interment. That period of time is called the period of Aninut. It is so intense, the mourning, even though the person may not feel it. It's such an intense and serious, important time that the laws and traditions follow. Number one, we do not try to console a mourner during this time. I'm sorry for your loss, and try to say sorry for the loss is acknowledging that's okay, but to try to say, to do more than that would be inappropriate. To try to, even without words, but to try to console a person at this time, this is not the time for it. because of the involvement in preparing whatever needs to be prepared for the burial, that person is actually absolved for mitzvot that require an activity. So, for example, putting on tefillin would a person would be prayer. Would be something that a person would be absolved from during this time until after the burial. Now, if the burial is extended several days, then there are exceptions, and that would be a different story. And we, in general, in Judaism, as we sort of indicated last week, because of the benefit to the soul, we try to bury as close as possible to this time of death, because of the benefits to the soul and the pain that goes through in the process of the soul moving up, as we discussed in previous weeks. Then we have the family members tearing part of their outer garment. This is something that we will also get to later, the meaning of this, why the tearing of the garment, the benefits of it, and so on. We will discuss that this evening. We skip the Shiva, which would be the next stage. The stage after Shiva is Shloshim. Shloshim is 30. Anybody who can count to 10 in Hebrew? Chat Shtayim, Shalosh. Shalosh is 3. Shloshim would be 30. So 30 days. It's 30 days from the burial. And during this time, people are to avoid wearing new clothing. People do not take haircuts until the end of the 30-day period. Even after that, typically the custom is that a person is told, or sort of told that your hair is getting a little long, and that's the indication after 30 days that now I could take a haircut. No festive events during this 30 days of mourning. So this is also a follow-up of the Shiva, a period of mourning, and we will talk about the benefits more as it relates to the Shiva as we go along in the class. I'm just taking a break to see some of the other students who came on. I want to acknowledge everyone that I didn't acknowledge from the beginning of class. So Larry and Betty, Marion, and David. Okay. The next period is the 12 months. Now, typically 12-month period of mourning is only observed out of respect for a parent. For a sibling, unfortunately for a child, one would only mourn for 30 days. And as we'll see later, that I might mention it again, but the idea is that obviously people's response, as we saw early in the lesson, people's response to death is very different. Everyone deals with it differently. These are general guidelines to help a person process the loss and to move forward. Obviously, not everybody is going to be up to, making that stop at 30 days. When we have bar mitzvahs, right? Not every kid is an adult at 13 years old, or for the girls at 12. Certainly for the boys at 13, not every boy is. I would say very few boys are actually ready to be adults. But that is the time frame where they start to mature and develop into an adult. And so too, when we talk about Shiva, this is to give us a time frame where we focus on certain levels of mourning so that we could eventually get through this mourning period and heal and move forward. So the laws and traditions for the 12 months are as follows. I already mentioned this is for a parent. Some shloshim restrictions, like avoiding festive events. It's customarily, some people have this custom, to keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months for a parent. For another family member, it would be for 30 days. Some people only for the Shiva. But for a parent, many people keep a flame for the entire 12-month period. Do not attend throughout the 12-month period a festive event. Some people, there are many different laws regarding each of these things. These are just highlights, but just to give us an idea of the process of mourning. Okay. In psychology, there are two tracks of mourning. When I say two tracks of mourning, there are studies that track mourning from a different perspective. One perspective, I skipped the yard site. So the yard site is the time period, is the anniversary of the passing, the laws and traditions, the recitation of Kaddish, additional Torah study, giving charity, extra good deeds, and the merit of the deceased. So those are things that are done every year on the yard site itself. Okay. So there are two tracks which generally we focus on when we talk about the mourning, the bereavement period, and how people get back to normal, and how to sort of understand where people are holding. So one focus is on the function of the person. How are they functioning? So we look to see, well, that person seems to be functioning pretty well. That person seems to be back at work, seems to be doing well, getting up, smiling, talking, not crying, so and so on. This is how they're functioning. That's one way. The engagement at work, maintaining relationships and other interests. They're going on vacation again, so they seem to be healing. That's one way to judge how a person is, again, not judging in the sense of judging someone, but understanding where a person is holding. So one way is from the way they're functioning. The other is their relationship, which means how their relationship with, their connection with the deceased, and the separation. So different people are going to separate and cling to and deal with it very differently. I'll give you a moment to have a look on page 94, where you have figure 3.3, where you could see the function and the relationship to the deceased in different areas, lost, emotional closeness, conflict, and so on, memory, reconnection. You have anxiety, depression, different things as self-esteem. So that's the function. Self-esteem would be the function, the anxiety, depression, these are all function. The connection to the deceased would be the relationship. That's another way of looking at it. So a different track. So we have these two tracks. This track was created by Simon Shimshon Rubin, a philosopher from the University of Haifa, and later he wrote this, I think it was in 1980s. In 2014, he actually published an article in which he showed how each step that we just went through, right? We just went through a whole bunch of steps of the period of immediately after the passing. We discussed the step of Shloshim, the 30 days, right? The Shiva, the 30 days, the 12 months, etc. And the yard site. He showed how each of these are beneficial and a help. Each of these things, from the steps of Aninut, right after the death until the burial, the Shiva, and so on, help a person get back to society, which is the function, and it also allows the person to heal in their internal feelings, which is related to the relationship. So each of these help us in both of these tracks. And that's very interesting, because while tradition and Torah, we do because we have faith and so on, and we believe in Hashem, and we believe in His Torah, and we're Jewish, and we try to keep as many traditions as we can. But what we're realizing here is how every mitzvah and every tradition that we have is actually there and serves as a tremendous benefit to us, emotional benefits, psychological benefits. And so we see here how these things of these different stages help us on both tracks. So if we look at Aninut, for example, don't think I have a, let's see what we have over here. No, okay. So if we look at page 96, you could have a look, Aninut, which that is the moment after death until burial. We only expect minimal function from the person. So this time we focus mostly on the respect and honor of the deceased, having them buried, having them prepared for burial, and so on. And that's why we said that we take away, we don't observe certain mitzvot. So again, we recognize the function, and we also recognize the relationship to the deceased. Then we move on to the Shiva, which is a time of limited function. And during that time, so that's how we work on the function. We start to develop and get a little bit more back to ourselves. And then there's sharing memories and so on during this period of time, again, focusing on the relationship to the deceased, but in the time of Shiva. Then we have the Shloshim, during the Shloshim period, the 30 days. So now the person goes back to work. So now the function has to increase. Again, this is the focus. The focus is to build the function. Not necessarily, again, will everybody build the function to the same degree and the same speed and so on. Also with relationship to the deceased, there's less time allocated to focus on the loss, which means during the Shiva period, there's a lot of thinking about the loss, the person one lost. After that, one has to move on to other areas of life and focus less on that to be able, again, to move forward. But of course, we still think of the loss, we still pray, we say the Kaddish, the study of Mishnah, and so on, that is continued during the Shloshim period. The 12 months is the same as the Shloshim period, except that it extends. The 30 days extends to 12 months, as we explained earlier, for a parent, out of respect for a parent. And then we have the Yartzeit period, where we have awareness of the loss, hopefully by the 12 months, or at least by the subsequent Yartzeits, anniversary of the passing, a person has gotten back to their regular function. That's the goal. But we still want to have awareness and continue that awareness. And again, in the relationship to the deceased, we're actually trying not to forget about the person, right? We don't want to forget about the relationship. And so we want to try to keep that relationship, to enhance that relationship, to build that relationship, except that we realize that relationship is different. It's more on a spiritual level. So what happens when reality strikes? What does Torah teach us? So let's have a look at the specifics. So we spoke a little bit in general, how we focus on the function, we focus on the relationship and the different steps to be able to get through it. So now we're going to talk about two specific things. We're going to talk about the tearing of the garment and the process of the Shiva. So talking about the tearing of the garments, I'll take a quick moment if anybody has any questions before we go into specifics. Okay, so I'm going to continue into the specifics. So we're going to start with the tearing of the garments. So tearing of the garments, the first time we find the idea of tearing of the garments comes from the story of Joseph. which we we spent some time on in the last JLI course. Text number 6, page 97. The brothers slaughtered the goat after they sold Joseph. They slaughtered the goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the colored tunic home and brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it's your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days. So the idea of tearing one's garment is the expression of pain and sorrow. And we want to give the mourner the opportunity to respond to and recognize their pain, the suffering that they're going through. And so what do? We give them a tangible, dignified way of expressing those emotions. But it's not only about grieving. Again, the idea of tearing garments is not only about grieving, it's actually a step in recovering, in overcoming that loss. Text number 7, triggering the grief process. Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz states that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. In my humble opinion, says Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, who's writing this piece, 1700s. In my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garment brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. So why would we do that then? The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss. Because the more we mourn, which is why we're going to see that Shiva is so important, the more a person mourns after the loss of a loved one, the easier it is to overcome that loss and the pain that comes with that loss. So we want to trigger mourning so that the person can go through those motions of pain, so that the person can get through it and recover. So, which is one of the reasons we tend to do it in public. Generally, we tear the garments in public, not in a private setting. I know many rabbis do the tearing of the garment in the room when it's done in a chapel. In the room before they come into the chapel and do the service. I personally like to do it in the public setting, both because I also like to do it as an education for people to see the garments being torn. But it really, when you allow people to mourn, and the more you allow them to do it, again, the more you're helping them overcome and get through that process. Okay. Finding comfort. We don't want to stay in a state of mourning. We want to ultimately get through it. So text number 8 is a text from the Talmud. The Talmud says, "Neither cry for the dead nor bemoan him." That's a quote from Jeremiah. Says the Talmud, neither cry for the dead doesn't mean you shouldn't cry for the dead. You shouldn't do it more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. How are we expected to act? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogy, and 30 days for restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. Once these have elapsed, God declares, "You are not more compassionate than I." which means God also mourns. But God, who is able to see the benefits, you see, God knows the benefits, but yet God still mourns because of his love for us. And God says, even though I love each of my children, at some point I have to get over it. Don't mourn forever, because I recognize, I mourn the fact that the loss. I mourn the fact that they are not here in this physical world able to fulfill their purpose. But ultimately, I recognize that the soul came into this world for a purpose, and once it leaves, now that purpose is over, the soul goes back, and the soul grows and is in a good place. So how do we actually move on? So we know that the Talmud tells us that we can't mourn forever. Many, many people continue to mourn way too long, and which means that whether it's 6 months later, 8 months later, a year later, 2 years later for some people. So how do we go through that process and allow ourselves to limit that mourning process? So here is something that some of you may have heard from me, whether it's at a funeral, at a shiva house. I usually share the text number 9b at a shiva house because I feel it's so powerful, and it's inserted in this lesson. So first, the consolation, and one point on the consolation before we go into text number 9b, and that is that how do we console someone? Instead of saying, I am sorry for your loss, and I will try to console you, what do we say? We say, may the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion, Jerusalem. It's not only about being religious. Mentioning God's name in this context is not only about being religious and recognizing God and sort of saying, oh, it's all in God's hands. It's not really what it's about. So what is it about? Why do I have to start mentioning God every time when someone's in pain? Why can't I just focus on that person's pain and say, I recognize that you're going through a hard time and I'm really sorry? Why do I have to start being religious at a time when a person's mourning and going through a personal loss? And the answer is that I'm really telling the person something even deeper. That I recognize that your pain and loss is so deep that I truly cannot console you. Ultimately, the only one who could truly console you is God. And by saying that, again, we're not just being religious. I am telling you that I recognize that the pain is so deep that I can't really console you. The only one who could really console you is God. That is recognizing and appreciating, showing the other person that you appreciate that the pain is very deep and very real. Only God can heal. The second part is, and this is what I usually mention, is we say, Hamakom Yinachem Eschem, may God console you amongst other members of Zion and Jerusalem. And the question is, why do I need to start mentioning Zion and Jerusalem? Again, why do we have to start getting religious on this person? Why can't I just say, I'm really, really sorry, Dave, your father, your mother passed away. I know it's really tough for you. I'm really sorry for your loss. May God bless you. Why do I have to say, may God comfort you amongst other members of Zion and Jerusalem? So this letter, this comes from a letter that was written by the Rebbe to Ariel Sharon in 1967 after the tragic passing of his son. And the Rebbe writes to him as follows. In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans, and before them the Babylonians, were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, because they ultimately destroyed the temple and took the gold and silver and so on, but not over its inner spiritual essence, contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Which means the inner spiritual essence of the temple and the soul of each and every single Jew, that's something that they never touched. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth. So, as we mentioned in the previous weeks, that what happens is the soul changes form. Until now, it has been together with the body, and now it is freed from the limitations of the body. And it's now a spiritual thing. So I recognize by mentioning Zion and Jerusalem, I'm giving over a message, which is why, some prayers in Judaism are best if we understand them. And this is one of them. That it shouldn't just be words. It has to be words with tremendous meaning, which is why I like to always share this at a Shiva house, to remind us that we are really recognizing the deep loss that the person is going through and feeling. Okay, so now that we have spoken and recognized a little bit about, one second, the importance of tearing the garment and the consolations that we give. So now, back here, now, again, it's the physical versus the spiritual in each of these things. We're going to go to the weekly meditation, which we can now better appreciate.
Today's reflection is going to involve an image which all of us probably have an immediate and strong reaction to. It is an icon for Jewish people all over the world and throughout the ages. An image that when we see it, we have a very strong and almost reflex response. I'm speaking of the image of the Western Wall, the only remaining vestige of the once glorious Holy Temple which stood in Jerusalem and was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We're going to use this image to help us in relating to our understanding of our relationship with those who have passed on. So imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye, the image of the temple, the glorious temple as it stood, as it was built by Solomon in its royal splendor, something that was revered by peoples all over the world. And now, juxtapose that glorious image with the image of the Western Wall as it stands now and has stood for 2,000 years in its destroyed state. Go back and forth between these two images. The temple as it stood in its glory, and the temple in ruins when we only have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is a symbol of destruction. The temple is no more. And yet, think about the hope, the strength, the inspiration, the spiritual and emotional energy that emanates from that image, even when the temple is in its destroyed state. Now think about a loved one who has passed on. Think about them when they were here with us in the physical world. Think about the situation at present when their physical body is no more. Are they really gone? Have they really lost their influence and power in your life? Or are they like the Western Wall, The Western Wall is an image of destruction, and yet the Western Wall is a symbol of inspiration and hope, pride, powerful, powerful emotions. Think of this image. Think of the feelings that it evokes in you. And now relate this as a symbol to those who are currently, physically, their vessel has been destroyed. But spiritually, their power is as great as ever. We'll take a moment now to reflect and to connect to this image and to relate it to our loved ones.
Okay. So we spoke about Zion. We spoke about death. And we recognize that the garments, rendering the garments, also is a reminder. Again, so before we spoke about how the rendering of the garments allows a person to express their feelings. So recognizing that a person has feelings, emotions, acknowledging that and allowing them to express it so they could actually start that period of mourning. But then it's also a reminder that the body is the garment. And the only thing that we really lost, that we're really mourning, is the garment. But the soul, the true essence of the person, continues to live on forever. That is expressed very nicely in an article, text number 10, which I'm not going to read, but you could read it after class, explaining the symbolism of the rendering of the garments. What happens? So we give a person the opportunity to tear their garments. We come, we try to console them. We recognize, we allow them to mourn. But what happens if a person is stuck in grief? There are many reasons why a person would be stuck in grief. And how does the Torah give us the ability, the tools, to deal with one who is stuck in grief? So there are many, many reasons, many causes for a person to be stuck in grief. Could be injustice, could be guilt, could be depression, sadness, anger. We are going to focus and give some tools for people who are stuck with guilt and anger. First, starting off with anger. So the reason why a person would be angry, and just to make this more emotional in the sense of to connect to it from an emotional level. I had a very hard time, maybe 10 years ago. It was a dear friend of mine who fortunately passed from a very serious cancer. But at the time that he passed away, I was visiting an individual who was either turning 100 or was 100 years old. Physically, he wasn't very mobile, but mentally, he was all there. And every week I would come to put on tefillin with him, and he would complain and say, I have no reason to live. Why am I still here? Why can't Hashem take me? And so on. And in my mind, I would think to myself, yeah, why, as we would say in Yiddish, favos taka? Why indeed? Here we have a healthy 35-year-old who is a young, I should say, 35-year-old who God took, and here who has a life ahead of him with children, a family, and here you have a 100-year-old who is praying to God to take him because he doesn't want to live on this world anymore. And of course, from a spiritual level, we understand that everybody comes for a purpose and reason. We can't understand what the purpose and reason is, but ultimately, in a very real way, this creates for many people anger, a level of a sense of injustice. Because how do I understand? Someone who passes away. I just heard this morning a tragedy of someone that I used to be in London. I used to be very close with, a little older than I am, but he lost a 19-year-old daughter this morning. Don't know the circumstances. It seems that there was something, but I don't know the story, whatever it was. But I was just thinking to myself, I have a 19-year-old daughter. What kind of a loss that is, and the pain that he would be that this person would be going through. I haven't spoken to him. I've seen him over the years, but I used to learn with him and have conversations with him when I was younger. And to think that he's going through that, and then so when it comes to someone who passes away young, so again we feel a certain sense of anger. Injustice has been done, and it's much more difficult for us to get over such a loss. Much more difficult than a person who's 95 or 100 years old and has lived a long life, and we sort of could come to terms with the fact that, yeah, we knew that no one lives forever. If they get past 85, 90, we're very, very lucky, and every day we're lucky, right? So the first thing is that people have anger and injustice, feelings of sense of emotions that are very real, and we have to recognize that. So how do we deal with that? So it could be, why did this person, this could be someone who's a little bit older, but they were very sick. Why do they deserve it? The person's too young. Why was this person wrong? The person's life has just begun. So many questions. So we're going to read a text from a book called Avos Reb Nosson, which is a commentary on Pirkei Avot, which many of us know as are familiar with it as Ethics of Our Fathers, and it says as follows. So, I'll give you a background of who this individual was. Okay, so we are going to be talking about a tragedy, a loss to an individual who was one of the greatest heroes of the Jewish people that we don't really speak often about, but during the destruction of the Second Temple, he was the leader of the Jewish people, to giving strength during one of the most difficult times in our history. The Jewish people, many of them were killed, many of them starved to death, taken in slavery to Rome. Very, very, very difficult period. I don't know, worse or less or more severe than the Holocaust, but certainly equal to the Holocaust in a terrible, terrible way. And this rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is the leader, the hero, the strongest man of the time, keeping everybody strong during tremendous loss and tragedy. And he's able to stay strong until he loses a son and no one can console him. So that's the background to this text. We're text number 11. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, and this text really gives us some advice and many very important lessons that are really great takeaways. Let's read it first. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, his students arrived to console him. Rabbi Eliezer entered. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, by the way, if anybody's read Ethics of Our Fathers, he had 5 students. And these are the 5 students who come to console him. The first one is Rabbi Eliezer. He enters and sat before him, and he says, Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he accepted consolation? For it is stated in Genesis, Adam was again intimate with his wife, which means he was able to sort of move forward, resume a normal life. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pained for Adam as well? So not only what he does to him is, instead of consoling him, he makes him realize how intense his loss is, and now he starts to feel the loss of someone else, because until a person's been through loss themselves, they can't truly appreciate what someone else has gone through. So now that he says, 1 second, you should be consoled and move on with life, just like Adam did. Well, 1 second, Adam also went through this. Uh-oh. Oh my God. That must have been so terrible for him. And now he's not only mourning for himself, but he's also mourning for Adam. So the next student comes in. Rabbi Shua entered and asked, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Shua said, Job had sons and daughters, and they all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should also accept consolation. How do we know that Job was consoled? For he declared, God has given and God has taken. May God's name be blessed. We say these words at the end of the funeral service. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pained for Job as well? So the next, Rabbi Yossi, entered and sat before him, Master. He said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yossi said, Aaron had 2 illustrious sons, but they both died in a single day, and yet he allowed himself to be consoled. As it stated, Aaron kept silent. His silence implied that he was without grievance and accepted consolation. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Aaron as well? Rabbi Shimon entered. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Shimon said, King David had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled, and you should also allow yourself to be consoled. How do we know that King David was consoled? For it is stated, David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and he was intimate with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. So should you, Master, allow yourself to be consoled. He moved forward. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for King David as well? Apparently they didn't come out and share what the other one had heard so that they could learn. This certainly wasn't rehearsed. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person, and I will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. You know, they've all made me pain, given me pain. What is Rabbi Elazar going to do? He's going to give me even more pain. I can't handle it anymore. Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yochanan and told him, let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear. Woe is to me. When will I emerge unharmed from this safekeeping role? You, Master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, and scriptures, in the Mishnah, the Halakha, and other teachings, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion. So what happened? So first of all, of course, with everyone else, we know that he was feeling, recognizing that other people had loss is not a reason for someone to be comforted. Now they could only appreciate the other person's loss. But we learn a couple lessons from here and understand what was going on with Rabbi Elazar and why that actually comforted him. So first of all, we can't compare people. That's a very, very important thing. Often we try to, there's two reasons why a person might be expressing their own personal grief. I also, by the way, people like to say, I lost a loved one. And I also went through it. And when my mother died, this is what I did. So it's mentioning that I also lost a loved one, that is very comforting for a person, because they recognize that they are in a good place. But giving advice of how you dealt with things and so on, and it's not always the right thing to do, because sometimes you just have to give time and quiet, because people deal with pain in a different way. And therefore you could say, well, I dealt with it this way, but the reality is that this person is not ready to deal with it. So we don't compare. And also because the person, not only can we not compare, but also the person, a lot of times people they're not ready for it. And so, yeah, later on, after the person is, started to move back to life, to routine, then we could discuss and help the person and so on. But giving them the way we dealt with a certain situation is not always the way that we could help someone who's truly mourning a loss. Now, we tend to do that in life because it's the easiest way to relate to someone when we ourselves went through something like that, and then we could feel that we could give them some advice. So when it comes with something like someone lost their job, or someone's dealing with someone who made them angry, so then we could try and find, because it isn't a deep mourning that a person's going through, and therefore we could give our advice. When it comes to mourning, the best thing is not to give advice, and just to be there and let the person mourn. And we'll talk about, and we'll see it in the next few minutes, we'll talk about how we do that. What did Rabbi Elazar do? There are 2 points. What he mentioned is, he mentions that to recognize that just like this king gave this thing, this gift, this item for safekeeping, to recognize that Hashem gave you a gift. It's a very, very empowering and very comforting thought. To recognize that the life of that person, of the loved one, whether it's a parent, sibling, whoever it is, every day that that person lived in this world was a gift from God. Wasn't something you earned, wasn't something that we deserved. It was a tremendous, tremendous gift that God gave. And we have to be thankful and grateful for every day that God gave life to our loved ones. The second thing that he sort of tells him is that the soul fulfilled its life, fulfilled its mission. It's a gift, but there also was fulfillment. What does that mean? So I've told this story before, that when I was about 10 years old, I heard a story. We always heard stories about the Rebbe. And I continue to tell stories of the Rebbe. And it's amazing how there's still endless stories that I've never heard before. So I'm fascinated. And when I'm fascinated and passionate, I share my passion and my fascination. Okay, so amazing stories. When I was 10 years old, I heard this story. I wasn't so fascinated. I was actually quite disturbed by the story. And it wasn't until I was older that I really appreciated the story in this context that we're discussing now. What was the story? The story was, there was a rabbi from California, and he got up and he said that there was a woman in his community that was coming to classes. Her husband was very sick. The doctors had given a couple weeks to live. And he encouraged her to go and get a blessing from the Rebbe. And she traveled to New York. She asked for a bracha, and the Rebbe gave her $1 to give to charity, and the Rebbe said till 120. Meaning, give him a long life, may he have been blessed with a long life. She came back full of hope, and the rabbi was happy. She got a blessing from the Rebbe, but sadly, a few weeks later, he passed away. He was extremely, extremely uncomfortable because he had given this woman so much hope. And she traveled to New York, got this encouragement, and he was embarrassed. And he did whatever he needed to do with the funeral. I don't remember if he was the rabbi of the funeral or whatever it was. He tried to keep a distance. He was embarrassed. He didn't know what to tell her. He didn't know I gave her all this hope, and what do I do now? How do I approach this and console her after giving her so much hope? A few weeks later, after she's gone through the Shiva period, she comes back to one of his classes. And after the class, he's sort of making himself busy to try to keep away from her, not to get into conversation. He doesn't know how to approach it. He was a very young rabbi at the time. And it must have been in his first years of being rabbi. And I have to say, those are the biggest mistakes that we made in those first couple of years. I'm glad I'm past it. Still making mistakes, but not as big as the ones I did in the first couple of years. You learn from your mistakes. One of them was at a funeral. I'll tell you in a second. But a funeral, it wasn't a funeral, it was an unveiling. But anyway, so eventually this woman comes to the rabbi and she says to him, I want to tell you something. The Rebbe's blessing for my husband, that he should live till 120, was an incredible blessing. In those couple weeks that he lived, he accomplished so much that to me it was as if he lived till 120. This is what the message that Rabbi Lazar is telling his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He's telling his teacher that every person comes down into this world. You know, the reason why we think of 90, 100, whatever it is, of the age, along, because that's what we're used to. So that becomes normal. Person should live till 90, 100, whatever years they should live. What happened if the average lifespan would be 240 years? Would 120 then be little or a lot? It'd still be a lot. It's still a gift. The point is that 120 years is not a number of years. It's a number of years to allow that person to fulfill their mission on this world. Some people, which is painful at the time, but some people fulfill their mission, and obviously this is not something that you're going to share on the first day or even during the Shiva or even during the Shloshim, right? Of a person who lost a loved one. But we can understand and appreciate that every single person comes into this world and lives 120 years. 120 years means, we always say that Jewish years are not measured by the passport. Jewish years are measured by fulfillment. How fulfilling is my life? That's the importance of a Jewish life, of Jewish years. So 120 years, a person could live 120 years in 70 years. A person could live 120 years in 50 years. As a family member, as a friend, I hope not, right? I hope they live longer. But after the fact, I could appreciate that every day I had with them was a gift. And every day that they lived here, they fulfilled, they made their living in this world worth it, or worthwhile. And that is something that can help us move on in appreciating and be comforted, knowing that every day I had that family member in my life was a gift. They fulfilled a mission. They came into this world for a purpose, and they fulfilled that mission. That is something that is very comforting. So we recognize that life is a deposit, and the terms are dictated. How long a person lives depends on what their mission is in this world. The second thing is guilt. So what happens is a person feels that I could have done more for this person, and so understanding what we discussed last week, that the soul continues to live on, and we could continue to have a relationship with our loved ones. That is very, very important in getting over guilt, a feeling of guilt that we could have done more for that person. Why? Because if the person's life ended when they're at their physical passing, at the time of death, so then I can feel guilty because I could have done more and I can't do it anymore. But if I recognize that they continue to live on, if I didn't do enough for them until now, I could actually do more for them now. This is such a comforting feeling. It's such an empowering feeling to recognize, the first step, so I can get rid of the anger. And that is to recognize that Hashem puts everybody here for a period of time. And they're here for a mission, and they fulfilled that mission, and then they moved on. But then I could move forward also from the feeling of guilt of what I could have done for that person. I wasn't there for enough. I didn't call them enough. I didn't speak to them enough. That you could also get over. How? By recognizing that now you could also continue that relationship. You could give tzedakah. You could study Torah. You could do so much. We're studying Torah. We dedicated this class to Adam's memory. We are doing for him something, even if we couldn't do more for him before. We continue to do things for him now, and that is a comforting feeling. Now I want to finish off with the Shiva. There is a video at this time. I'll try to be brief after the video to just finish off a couple things, highlights related to the Shiva. So bear with me. Let's just go to. These are things that we could do for a person after they passed away.
When a loved one passes away, Jewish law calls upon the immediate family to experience the rite of Shiva. Approximately 7 days are spent in mourning and receiving comfort from visitors. A doctor, a rabbi, and an acclaimed lecturer offer personal reflections on the rite of Shiva.
When someone dies, the relationship with the deceased doesn't end. The relationship with the person who died continues. It just changes from a face-to-face interpersonal relationship to a relationship of memories, to a relationship of legacies. By engaging the mourners in this process, you're helping them make that shift.
The purpose of Shiva is meant for the mourner to be able to take that time aside from the affairs of life and affairs of the world, to contemplate, to introspect, and to share with others the life they had, with the person they loved. People come to visit and console and try to bring comfort to the mourner.
The structure of it and the formality of it, it gives a sense of relief. You know, when you're grieving, it's very all over the place, very hard to contain. And the structure of the Shiva brings a relief and a sense of conformity, which is quite redeeming.
If you want to help comfort the griever, what you're in essence doing by taking an interest in the person who has died is helping that person preserve his life.
I remember hearing people say things to me that was almost like they said it and the words stopped right here. But days and weeks and months later, they slowly made their way in.
The point of the Shiva is not to come up with anything brilliantly comforting to say, because there really isn't anything to say. Rather, it's just simply to be there.
One person who lost a toddler under very, very tragic circumstances told me what was the most comforting visit all week. And I'll say it the way he said it. He said an older gentleman with a lot of life experience came in. He said he sat in front of him and he asked to see a picture of his daughter. He gave him the picture. He looked at the picture. He cried for 10 minutes straight. He gave the picture back. He said the traditional verse that you say as you leave, and that was it. And he said that was, without a doubt, the most comforting visit.
But in retrospect, I have to say that that week of the passage between one reality and the next reality, somehow I have to believe in His infinite wisdom, God saw to it that this passage not be taken alone, even while feeling lonely.
Take on a mitzvah. Do something, and it can be tiny, but I'm going to do it in memory of this person, and especially if it fits with that person. That's comforting. Now the world's a slightly better place because of that person.
Okay, so when it comes to the Shiva, there are many, many traditions that we do. We cover mirrors and pictures. I believe in the, there are some writings and some articles in the back of the lesson, which can help you with some of the ideas of covering mirrors and pictures. Mourners remain in the house of the mourning, specifically to be in the Shiva house. Sit on low stools, no leather footwear, avoid listening to music, no shaving or haircuts, abstain from work, avoid Torah study, restrictions on bathing and laundry, prayer service in the home, and visit the mourners. So these are many, many different laws. We're not going to go into the reasons for them, but these are all, again, to help us through both the process of to allow the person to limit the function and to get through this and have that mourning process, which is very important. So Maimonides says this is a deed of kindness that has no limits. Regarding the text number 13, I'm not going to read the whole text, but this is the highlight of the text, which basically tells us that the visiting someone who is going through the mourning process is an act of Ahavas Yisrael, love for one's fellow. It's an important thing. We are doing so much to them by making a call, by making a visit, even if we don't feel up to it, even if we don't feel we're going to benefit them. Just the call itself, as we saw in the video, is something that's very, very powerful. The reward is the silence, which means that it's not about what we say, but it's about just being there. Simply being there. That's very, very important. In general, these are some of the things that we try to conduct in a house of mourning, that it should be the mourner who opens the conversation. So typically we would sit. If the mourner can't start the conversation, so then we will trigger conversation, but the conversation should be what's on the mourner's heart, rather than us creating conversation and starting to go off on a tangent and talk about sports and talk about other things, tell jokes, which happens in many Shiva homes, which doesn't allow the person to actually get through that process of the healing, which the Shiva is supposed to accomplish. Don't attempt to lighten the mood. Again, I was trying to read what it says there because I have something on top of it. So we don't want to make it light. We want the person to grieve, to share, but it should be them who sharing what's on their heart. Allow them to lead the conversation is very important. Don't say or ask anything intrusive. We don't want to say too much or ask too much. We don't want to try to be the philosophers. Try to give them insights and help them. It's the wrong time. Later, in a month, in a couple of weeks, maybe, perhaps, but not now. During the Shiva, this is a time where we just have to be there for them to allow them to go through the mourning, and then afterwards because they went through the mourning. It's not what you told them. I was recently at a shiva where there was someone there just going on giving advice. You got to get over it. You got to move forward. You got to do this and that. It was just, I was like, I was cringing. I couldn't say anything, but like, that's not, you're not going to help this person by telling them what to do, and that they're strong and they could do it. All they have to hear now is we know you're going through a lot. It is painful. Let them feel that pain now, so that afterwards they can move on. Because if now they're moving on and they don't feel the pain, you know what happens later. Many people turn around months later or a year later and realize that it's such a tremendous loss, and now they don't know how to deal with it, because they never went through the original, the mourning period of Shiva, which is really, really powerful and helpful. So what do? We want to discuss a legacy, direct grief from passive depression to active mourning. We talk about a legacy. What could we do for the loved ones? We see, it says here, we shift the focus to gift of life that was, how the tremendous impact they made. These are things that we want to discuss during the Shiva. Again, it should be led by the mourners, initiated by the mourners, but we could trigger, but these are the kind of conversations that we want to talk about. And really, this also, what it does is it's a powerful thing for the soul. And that I want to finish off with text number 16. That's going to be the last text that I'm going to read. I know I went over a little bit. I hope you forgive me. I know you guys don't have to go home. I know I don't. So this is for the travel time. So I take travel time now into consideration. Okay, text number 16. The final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds, commenting so-and-so was upright, so-and-so was God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about him. If they say that he had been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise. So the praises that we give during the Shiva, we talk about the person, sometimes it's just very, very important that we don't talk about. Sometimes people feel the need, when someone wasn't perfect, to, they don't want to make the person sound like they're exaggerating about the person. So what they'll do is they'll say the things, but we know he also had the dark side to him, but we won't discuss that too much. We'll make a few jokes about it. But if you really knew the person well, you knew that he had a very sensitive side to him. He's a really good person. That anything negative is best not to be said, and it's okay. They're actually in the Torah portion. We have Achrei Mot, Kedoshim, Emor. These are 3 Torah portions. Achrei Mot is 1, Kedoshim, and then Emor. Achrei Mot means after the death of Aaron's sons. Achrei Mot, after the death. Kedoshim is about sanctity. Emor means to say. So we, as a joke, people always say, Achrei Mot, after death, Kedoshim, Emor. You should talk about a person that is holy. Yes, we often hear about people, somehow anybody who ever dies is a wonderful person. What happened to all the people who are mean-spirited that we experienced in our lifetime? We don't like to talk about it. Why? Because the positive things that we say about a person after a person passes away actually impacts the person's soul, and it's very important that we only speak positively about a person.